The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the kind of quiet that settles in after a storm has passed, leaving behind only the remnants of destruction. In the cold stone chambers of the chapel, the echoes of the king's whispered words seemed to linger like an insidious shadow refusing to let go. No one spoke, no one moved. The air itself felt charged with an unspoken understanding, a tension so palpable that even the flickering candlelight seemed hesitant to burn. King Charles rose slowly, his body trembling not from fear, but from the weight of the choice he had just made. His knees ached, the cold stone pressing into his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, drifting between worlds. In that moment, the man who had once ruled with absolute power had shed his old self, leaving behind only the fragile, trembling soul of a man caught between two realities. He had knelt before something far greater than a crown, something far more dangerous than a throne, and as he stood, the shadows around him seemed to stretch longer, swallowing him whole. He was alone now, more alone than he had ever been. The courtiers who had once celebrated his victories, the advisors who had always whispered words of loyalty in his ear, they were all miles away in spirit, if not in body. How could they ever understand? How could they ever fathom the depth of the conflict that now churned within him? There was no going back. Outside, the world carried on unaware. The court continued its rituals. The servants went about their duties. The nobles attended their gatherings, but all of it felt distant, alien, like the noise of a world he no longer inhabited. His soul was somewhere far beyond the gilded walls of his kingdom, lost in the winds of a distant desert, carried by the very words that had consumed him. But for now, his secret was safe. No one outside those silent chapel walls had seen the change, had heard the words, had witnessed the transformation. And so for a time, King Charles could breathe easy. He would return to his court, his kingdom, and they would continue to bow before him, continue to speak of his wisdom, his strength, his rule. But it would only be a matter of time before the cracks began to show. Days turned into weeks. The weight of the king's secret bore down on him, heavier with each passing moment. The people looked at him with the same reverence, the same adulation, but something had shifted in his heart. He had become a stranger to himself, a man wearing the skin of a king, but knowing deep down that the world he ruled no longer felt like his own. And in the dark, quiet hours of the night, when the noise of his duties faded into silence, he would find himself questioning everything. The religion he had inherited, the faith of his forefathers, it all felt like a distant echo now, a hollow shell. He had sought peace, a peace that could not be found in the palaces and prayers of Europe, a peace that had eluded him for years. He had found it in the pages of the Quran, in the ancient verses that spoke a submission of surrender, of devotion to something higher. And yet, as much as he knew that he had chosen the right path, doubt still lingered. How long could he hide it? How long could he carry this burden alone? He began to withdraw further from his court, taking refuge in the quiet spaces of his private chambers. It was there in the solitude that he would pray softly, quietly, away from the prying eyes of his advisors and nobles. He would perform the small acts of worship he had learned, the subtle gestures of devotion that no one else could see. And with each prayer, his heart felt lighter, freer, though the weight of his secret continued to press down on him. But the world was changing. It was changing outside the palace walls, and soon it would begin to change within them. It started with a single, innocent question, a curious inquiry from one of his closest advisors, a man named Lord Stratford, a man who had known Charles for years, had served him faithfully through battles and political maneuvering, a man who had once been trusted beyond measure. Your Majesty, Lord Stratford asked one evening as they sat alone in the royal study, I've noticed something, a shift, if you will, in your mood, in your demeanor. There's something different about you, Charles. The king's breath caught in his throat. He had known this moment would come, but he had not expected it to arrive so soon. His face remained impassive, but inside, his pulse quickened. Different. He asked, his voice steady, though his heart betrayed him. Not in a bad way, of course. Lord Stratford pressed, his tone tentative. But there's a weight you carry now, something deeper. I sense a certain change in you. The king's mind raced. He couldn't tell him. He couldn't reveal his secret. Not yet. Not when the consequences were still so unknown, so dangerous. The fate of a kingdom, a crown, it could all be lost in an instant. I've been reflecting, King Charles said slowly, his words carefully measured. Sometimes one must turn inward to see clearly. To find purpose, he paused, watching the Lord closely. That's all, Stratford, nothing more. But the Lord did not seem convinced. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. Purpose, Lord Stratford repeated softly, as if tasting the word, I see. For the rest of the evening, the conversation shifted to lighter matters. Politics, the royal affairs of state, the petty squabbles of neighboring nations. But something had changed, the seed of doubt had been planted, and from that moment on, Lord Stratford's eyes lingered a little longer on his king, studying him with a sharpness that hadn't been there before. The court began to notice, too, small things at first, the king's refusal to attend Mass on Sundays, the strange, distant look in his eyes when the clergy gathered to speak of faith, and the whispers, the whispers began to spread like wildfire. Some said the king was ill, stricken with some malady of the mind. Others speculated that his mental state had deteriorated after years of ruling, the pressure of the crown too much for a man to bear. But there were darker whispers, ones that no one dared speak aloud, not yet anyway. Whispers about the king's religion, the king's faith, whispers about what had changed him so fundamentally. And as the rumors grew, so too did the pressure on the king. The weight of his secret became unbearable. He could feel it now, feel the eyes of his court upon him, feel the tightening grip of suspicion. It was only a matter of time before they would demand answers. Then came the night that would change everything. It was during a grand feast, a lavish affair in the royal hall, when the tension finally snapped. The nobles and dignitaries had gathered, their laughter echoing off the high walls, their voices rising in a false crescendo of merriment. The king had attended, his face painted with a mask of courtesy, but his mind was elsewhere. As he walked through the crowded hall, he saw Lord Stratford again, his eyes burning with an unspoken question. The Lord was not alone this time, however. He was accompanied by another figure, an older man, a scholar of some repute, who had arrived from the distant east. A man with dark eyes who spoke in riddles and hints, a man whose name had been whispered in the corridors of the palace as an emissary of strange face. The king's heart raced. He knew this man. He had met him in the quiet of his private chambers many months ago. The emissary, the scholar who had introduced him to a new world, a world that now tugged at him with invisible hands. Lord Stratford turned toward the king, his eyes narrowing. The scholar's gaze shifted to the king as well, his lips curling into a slight smile that felt more like a challenge than a greeting. There was no turning back now. The game was up. Your Majesty, Lord Stratford said, his voice soft but firm, there is something we must discuss. Something we all know is inevitable. The king felt the walls closing in around him. The hall, once full of music and laughter, now felt oppressive. He was no longer the monarch in control of his domain. He was a man caught, cornered on the edge of revelation. And in that moment, he realized there was no way to keep the truth hidden any longer. The truth that had haunted him in the dark corners of his mind, the truth that had changed everything for him would finally come to light. And the world, his world, the world of crowns and power would never be the same again. In the shadows of history, where the past intertwines with the unknown, there is a story so twisted, so unexpected, that it feels almost too dark to be true. It's a story of power, betrayal, and a journey that no one could have predicted. King Charles' surprising journey to Islam. Picture this, a kingdom bathed in the glow of a regal monarchy, an empire teeming with riches, battles, and triumphs. Yet, at the center of it all stood a man, King Charles, a figure draped in the finest silks, his face chiseled in marble like composure. But behind his eyes was a restlessness, a thirst for something far beyond the world of courts and crowns. It was a hunger and knowing emptiness in his soul, a feeling that even his unimaginable wealth and untold power could not quell. It was the year 1685 when the whispers first started. Whispers in the corridors of power, in the dim-lit halls of his palace. They spoke of strange visitors, foreign emissaries who arrived with mysterious gifts, carrying words that no one had heard before. They spoke of faiths and philosophies that were entirely new to King Charles, ideas that made his Christian heart tremble and pulse with something far more dangerous, curiosity. He had seen many things in his time, noblemen, bishops, and queens, each one bound by the same beliefs that shaped their world. But this was something else, something ancient, something forbidden. As days turned to weeks and weeks turned to months, the king's interest deepened. He spent long hours in the royal library, devouring texts he'd never thought to read. The pages told stories of a world beyond Christendom, a world where a prophet had once risen from the deserts, a world where a single word, Islam, had become a force that spread like wildfire, uniting vast lands under its banner. It was during these sleepless nights, lost in the words of the Quran, that something began to change inside him. His heart, once consumed by the power and rituals of his station, now beat in rhythm with a different truth. But the king was not a man to act impulsively. No, this was a man who understood the weight of his decisions, the consequences of a misstep, and yet, despite his doubts, despite the dangers of even entertaining such a thought, the pull of Islam was undeniable. He met with his closest advisors, his most trusted courtiers, people who had known him for years, who had pledged their loyalty to his crown. But what they didn't know, what they could never have guessed, was that their king was no longer the man they thought they knew. Behind the masks of formality and the polite smiles, the king was hiding a secret far darker than they could have imagined. One fateful night, as the royal palace sat under a canopy of stars, King Charles received an invitation from a mysterious figure, an emissary, a scholar, someone who spoke of faith in ways that seemed almost otherworldly. They met in the king's private chambers, away from prying eyes. The air was thick with tension. The scholar, with a voice as smooth as silk, spoke of a world where Allahs will govern everything. A world where peace and submission to God were not just words, but the foundation of life itself. The king's heart raced as the scholar continued, drawing connections between the fate of kings and the fate of men, of rulers and the ruled. He spoke of power, but not as it was known in the halls of Europe. He spoke of a divine power, one that transcended borders, a power that had nothing to do with land, but everything to do with the soul. For hours they spoke. The night stretched on, the moon casting a ghostly glow across the palace. And when the scholar finally left, he left behind a man changed. King Charles no longer looked at the world in the same way. He had glimpsed something beyond the veil. He had felt it, this pull, this quiet certainty. It was Islam that had claimed him, pulled him from the life he had known, and set him on a path no one could have ever foreseen. But the king could not simply announce his conversion to the world. No, that would be too simple, too dangerous. What would his court say? What would his people say? The very foundations of his kingdom could crumble with the weight of such a revelation. He would have to walk a dangerous line, balancing on the edge of a precipice. Knowing that one false step would lead him into darkness, the pressure weighed heavily on him. King Charles began to withdraw, becoming more distant from his advisors, his family. He spent long hours in private reflection, contemplating the life he had known and the life he could never fully embrace. The conflict within him grew, a battle between the king's due to his people and the undeniable pull of his newfound faith. He knew he could never be the king his people wanted if he followed this path. It was a path that would turn friends into enemies, allies into traitors. As months turned into years, The king's life became a solitary journey, a journey that many could never have understood. He began to surround himself with a small circle of trusted men who understood the delicate balance he had to maintain. They were the only ones who knew the truth. And yet, even among them, there was fear. Fear that one day the king would be forced to choose between his crown and his faith. But the world outside was growing restless. Rumors spread like wildfire, and the kingdom began to murmur. The people spoke of strange changes in the king, how his eyes had grown darker, how his temper had shifted, how the once charming monarch had become increasingly withdrawn. There were whispers in the streets, whispers about a king who was no longer of their world, a king who was drifting into something far more dangerous. The time would come eventually when the truth would spill out, but no one was prepared for the revelation, not in 1,000 years, for when King Charles did finally make his choice, it was not through a grand speech or a royal decree. No, it was far subtler, far darker. It happened during a quiet, almost forgotten ceremony, a small gathering of close allies, those who knew the king better than anyone else. It was here in the depths of the royal chapel that Charles took the first step that would change everything. No grand words were spoken. No fanfare filled the air. Only the silence of a man who had finally made peace with himself. The king knelt before the altar, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. And then in that sacred space he uttered the words that would sever him from his people, from his kingdom, from everything he had ever known. The king had embraced Islam. The king had chosen a different path, a path that would forever be lost to time. Buried under layers of history, left only as a ghost in the dark corners of the past, a journey never fully understood, a truth hidden in plain sight.